Speaking of fascism, time to talk about Israel.
Breaking news from Israel with the deepening turmoil there over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's move to limit the independence of the country's Supreme Court. Weeks and weeks of protests have led to this. You're looking at the scene outside the Israeli legislature. That's the Knesset in Jerusalem. And a new wave of protest erupted yesterday after the defense minister there was fired for calling for a delay in this plan until after Easter and Passover. This morning, labor unions called for a general strike, and the protests may have actually forced Netanyahu and his right-wing government to reconsider, or at least consider a pause.
Israel is bracing for further protests today, and the prime minister is facing the greatest threat yet to his coalition government. There are now reports that you mentioned he may halt that overhaul following a long night of nationwide demonstrations. Organizers.
This is pretty wild. It's wild. Obviously, you can't have a conversation about Israel and internal politics within Israel without having a conversation about Israeli apartheid state conditions imposed upon the Palestinian population, which they control over land that they stole. The two go hand in hand, and it fits in this conversation as well. But if I were to, for a second, try to look at this as though Israel was not a violent theocratic ethno-state with that is built on top of Palestinian graves, it's obviously going to happen in the way that it has. Bibi Netanyahu is incredibly corrupt and has, not single-handedly, but has very deliberately made Israel even more right-wing. It's interesting to considering that, the Israeli nation building project is an inherently reactionary one that was created by, colonialists that had no say, or should have had no say whatsoever on what gets divvied up to who in that land. Having said that, Netanyahu has been also uniquely right-wing, and over the course of the past couple of decades, it has gotten to a point where the domestic politics of Israel that do not pertain to the Arab Israelis or the non-Israeli citizen Palestinians that also have to cohabitate these spaces, which they are systemically discriminated from cohabitating. It's become so right-wing that even the liberals in Israel, which oftentimes have really reactionary perspectives as it pertains to dealing with Arab Israelis or even Palestinians in general, are very upset at the right-wing government. Why am I consistently talking about Palestinians in this conversation? Because that is the division that they utilize. Just like the right wing, if I were to talk about a comparison for Americans and American Jews that, have maybe heard about Israel from their parents or whatever, it's a decent comparison to mention, even though it's not 100% analogous. But the right wing in America routinely weaponizes anti-black sentiment. The systems itself are obviously very much not in favor of black liberation. It's designed in that way. So that much is permanent. And the right-wing Israeli government weaponizes Palestinian existence in that exact same way. Of course, no matter what happens, obviously, if you were to make a comparison to the existence currently of Palestinians on Palestinian soil, if you were to make a comparison to black people living in U.S. soil, that would be, I hate that we're doing oppression Olympics almost, but that would be more favorable. This does not undermine contemporary black existence in America, but the reality is that's how devastating it is for Palestinians. And their everyday existence, not having water supply, having all matter of their existence controlled by an apartheid state that is incredibly violent towards them. It's more akin to Jim Crow. Yes, that is only if we're talking about, in some ways, Jim Crow would be again, more favorable position for the Palestinians if there was full-blown integration from where they're at right now. There are things that happen in Israeli-occupied territory that would not have happened even in the Jim Crow South. That is how devastating that existence is. And this is before we even talk about Gaza. Gaza is an open-air prison. It's the largest open-air prison on the planet. It gets routinely bombed. There's no comparison to it currently on the planet. More akin to indigenous genocide. On the one hand, I'm glad to see many Israelis protesting their far-right governments that tend to turn Israel into a dictatorship. On the other hand, I wonder where all the protests were over West Bank Palestinians living under Israeli dictatorship for over 50 years. The Israeli dictatorship now, domestically speaking, is trying to undermine the Israeli Supreme Court. That's what's going on. For those of you who are not caught up on why these protests are happening in Israel, it's because since this formation of the Netanyahu government, which featured some of the most insanely far-right members that were considered terrorists by the Israeli government originally, like Ben Gvir, Netanyahu has united literally some of the most reactionary, fascist, supremacist terrorists in his coalition. Part of their goal was to basically undermine the Supreme Court to ensure that they can get away with like whatever kind of legislation they want to get away with. Some of these guys are like anti-LGBT. Some of these guys are anti-miscegenation. A lot of these guys are anti-miscegenation. The Kahanas were considered terrorists even by U.S. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. And now the defense minister spoke out against it and was immediately fired. And you got the police chief and all these other Israelis like immediately mobilizing and creating a mass movement in Israel. Are there Israeli activists fighting for Palestine? Of course there are. There are plenty of also American Jews that are fighting for Palestinian rights and Palestinian liberation. And there are, of course, Israeli activists that are fighting for Palestinian rights and liberation as well. The unfortunate problem is that it's not as commonplace and it's not as popular a movement. Even within the ranks of the Israeli left, it's what I would liken it to is basically like America's existing imperialist affairs in both Iraq, Afghanistan, and numerous parts of the Middle East, and the supposed leftists in America that are left-wing for every other purpose with the exception of America's war on the global south. It's damn near identical. It is very, very far right with its treatment of Palestinians. It's incredibly reactionary. One of the most reactionary formations. Here's Noam Chomsky talking about what's going on in Israel.
I've never called it apartheid because it's worse than apartheid. South Africa depended on its black population.
I've heard Noam Chomsky say this before.
85% of the population. They were the workforce. They needed them. South Africa tried actually to get the Bantustans to be recognized, try to make them look viable. Israel doesn't do that with the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Just wants to get rid of them.
I think it's a way lower percentage of the comparison you made about leftist Americans speaking out against the war. Yes, because there's never going to be a one-to-one comparison because it's literally both like the treatment of black people in the Jim Crow South while also simultaneously active war against them. And not in the way that like there have been firebombing campaigns in like, fucking Philadelphia in 1985 or the bombing of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking like literally everyday existence. If everyday existence was like Tulsa, non-fucking stop. It's like Jim Crow and Trail of Tears all together. Exactly. A central aspect of the ongoing Nakba is the systematic, ongoing, and arbitrary forced displacement of Palestinians, including what has been described as the ghettoization of the Palestinian population through transfers, confiscation of land, and the concentration and confinement of as many as possible of those remaining in the smallest possible areas of land. Yes, and it's ongoing. It was formational. It was foundational. It was important for the development of the Israeli nation state, and it is continuing to this very day, which is part of the reason why it's a weird thing to discuss with Israeli citizens because they have to come to terms with the way that their nation state was built. It's like trying to have a conversation with Americans about the way that the American nation state was built on genocide of indigenous populations and slavery. As an Israeli, I will say we are brainwashed since birth. I think all Arabs around us, with no exception, want to demolish all of us because we are Jewish. So that's why so many Israelis think they save us when they go to the IDF or bomb Gaza, etc. Yes, it's incredibly powerful propaganda from birth. It's also tied to a very real and understandable fear that is existential about ethnic cleansing of Jews. Because of the history of Judaism, because of the history of Jewish people throughout society being constantly and consistently blamed for all of society's problems, whether it be pogroms or whether it be, obviously, the Holocaust. There is a very real existential that is taught and also it's learned from and it's an understandable one too, that is learned from an early age. and it is being very cynically weaponized by those in positions of power in the Israeli government. That's what makes it the most effective kind of propaganda, because there's truth to it. Okay, well, we're going to listen to wonderful Amy Goodman, my queen, talk about Israel and Palestine and the Israeli protests intensifying over Netanyahu's government weakening judiciary as Palestinian rights are ignored.
We begin today's show looking at the growing political crisis in Israel. Workers across Israel are taking part in a general strike today to protest plans by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to disempower Israel's judiciary. The strike has shut down Israel's two main seaports. Flights have been suspended at Israel's Ben Gurion airport. The strike has also shut down schools, banks, and other institutions. Over the weekend, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took part in protests. Many blocked roads and highways, shutting down large parts of the country. On Sunday, Prime Minister Netanyahu fired his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who had warned that plans to overhaul the judiciary posed a, quote, clear, immediate, and tangible threat to the security of the state. These are the voices of some of the protesters in Tel Aviv this weekend.
This is an emergency time for the democracy of Israel, and we're all here to fight for the liberal democracy and our rights in the Jewish state, which was established 75 years ago.
What are the protesters protesting specifically? They are not protesting about Palestinians. They are not. This has nothing to do with Palestinians. This is internal conflict within Israel. This is simply about the Netanyahu government trying to create more power for themselves by undermining the judiciary, undermining the Supreme Court. That's it. The far-right government formation in Israel was so damaging and devastating to Palestinian existence, more so than prior formations, which was already fucking a threat to the existence of Palestinians. Like, there's nothing you could do in this situation. You just, like, sit back and watch, Israelis protest the far-right government. The reason why Israelis are protesting the far-right government is because it's becoming more authoritarian towards Israelis. Understand that. They're not protesting because, like, the government has been too authoritarian towards Palestinians. It's similar to the treatment of Kurds in the Erdogan regime. Anytime some shit pops off internally for domestic reasons, whether it be a corruption charge that is truly never going to get prosecuted, whether it be anything, Erdogan will go and squeeze the Kurdish populations and cause them to retaliate, and then basically do everything he can to squash that retaliation in the most violent way possible, because it galvanizes everyone. It's a played out tactic, but it's a very effective one. Israel does the same to Palestinians. The unfortunate reality is that for a lot of people, due to social conditioning, a lot of people in Israel, there is no consideration for Palestinian people as human beings. They are just seen as an aberration. They are seen as people who are, by existing in the same land that they have existed for many, many, many generations, they are a threat to the safety and security of Israel. That is the number one way of thinking about Palestinians in Israel. So right now, they can't even hit the let's fucking eviscerate and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians button, because they hit it so much, it's not working anymore. Because there are a lot of liberal citizens of Israel who otherwise, in other circumstances, might have genuinely been like, yeah, you're right, actually, Palestinians are the real problem, let's focus on that, are now looking at directly the Israeli government and going, no, fuck this shit, dude, what are you doing? Like, you have people who are anti-race mixing. You have people who are insanely illiberal, that are anti-LGBT, harming Israeli citizens' existence, threatening their existence in this, theocratic ethno-state. I think you give the liberals too much credit. Wait, what? What are you talking about? I'm not giving them too much credit at all. I'm telling you how it is. It's not because, like, they're worried about Palestinians one way or the other. They're worried about their own existence. That's it. I'm criticizing them from that front because they don't even fucking realize that, like, the mistreatment and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and systemic displacement of Palestinians is playing a role in basically solidifying the far-right reactionary fascist government. They are used as a weapon. Their mistreatment is utilized as a weapon, is deployed anytime Netanyahu wants to shut everyone the fuck up. That's it.
I mean, the parallels with the United States between Netanyahu and Trump, both are under investigation. Netanyahu has been indicted for corruption. Trump is about, it looks like, to be indicted. And both trying to now completely going after the judiciary. In fact, if these judicial changes went through, wouldn't that also benefit Netanyahu personally?
Okay, this is too liberal of a take. Netanyahu is a more successful fascist than Donald Trump and is ideologically motivated by fascism more than Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is motivated by self-preservation. Netanyahu is motivated by self-preservation as well, but he has an underlying ideological reason for doing the things that he does. That's number one. Number two, the United States Supreme Court is already effectively in the hands of hyper-capitalists that are going to do whatever the fuck they can, that are going to basically turn a blind eye to criminal oppressive hierarchies, that are going to allow, child slavery to continue, all that sort of shit. Whereas the Supreme Court, as far as it goes in Israel for Israelis, okay, Israeli Jews and Israelis in general, not Arab Israelis, but specifically Israelis, non-Arab Israelis, is seen as a safeguard for protecting civil society. Anyway, it's an important distinction, and yet I think the Supreme Court is a safeguard for them as well, to a certain degree. But ultimately, the Supreme Court is seen as is seen as a way to prevent further erosion of civil liberties for Israelis in general. This is the reason why people are very upset.
Protesters poured onto the streets of Tel Aviv, taking over the main highway, shouting, "Israel is not a dictatorship."
I mean, this is kind of laughable to say. Let's be real. It 100% is a dictatorship when you consider its treatment and mistreatment of Palestinians in general. But they're saying it's not a dictatorship for Israelis.
The eruption came on the back of Netanyahu's firing of his defense minister for breaking ranks with the prime minister's hardline policies. The growing rift in our society is penetrating the Israeli Defense Force and security agency.
Yeah, he was saying this point of contention is making us less secure against the Palestinian plight. You know what I mean? Against the blight. Sorry, not plight. Blight, the Palestinian blight. Pretty much. I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically like that. He's saying we can't secure our borders against those Palestinian terrorists who want to kill us if you keep doing this shit about the Supreme Court.
The proposals would see government control over the appointment of judges, including the Supreme Court, while restricting the court's rights to veto legislation or rule against the government. That's been met with weeks of anti-government protests and nationwide strikes.
Well, Jose, in just the last few minutes, a far-right member of Netanyahu's government, Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, has said he is prepared to accept a delay in the judicial overhaul. Now, the reason this matters is Netanyahu has been under a lot of pressure from the right wing of his government, from right-wing protesters like the ones you can see behind me.
Thank God. Guys, that terrorist dog Ben-Gvir said he'll take not even a compromise, but just a pause, a delay. It's good. It's cool, man. Thanks. By the way, this is a deliberate thing that Ben-Gvir is doing. He's in charge of security in Jerusalem, which is such a fucked up thing to do. An additional fuck you by Netanyahu, okay? Right wing to Netanyahu? Yes. Right wing to Netanyahu? Yes. Imagine that. Literal fucking Kahanist terrorists, okay? People that America considered too far right for Israel. Think about that. That fucking piece of shit is dude, it's okay. I'll take a backseat for now. As long as you let me, arm everyone in Jerusalem, every settler in Jerusalem and allow us to just murder Palestinians every time we want to murder them. Without any sort of fucking scrutiny whatsoever, any sort of legal scrutiny whatsoever. Oh yeah, this is funny. It's breaking. Israel on the verge of a civil war between far right and far right. Even further right. The furthest right. I hate the burst of his bubble, but Netanyahu is merely postponing the showdown by a month and has signed a document granting Itamar Ben-Gvir, a convicted terror criminal, a private militia. Oh, thank God. That's awesome. No, just straight. Yeah, Praetorian Guard is right, dude. Holy fuck. Dude, Ben-Gvir is such a fucking freak, dude. No joke, they're calling it a National Guard. Oh, thank God, Ben-Gvir was on national television before Rabin was murdered with his car emblem. Yeah, And he said, literally a week before he was murdered, he said, we got to his car. Next, we will get to him. And then he got fucking murdered. Ben-Gvir was literally designated as a terrorist by Israel. It's like if Osama bin Laden was like, no, dog, you're going too far. Let's fucking calm down, to a guy who's like a bigger fucking terrorist, okay? Like, it's insane. Now, that is going to be very frustrating for people as a pill to swallow, okay? People are going to be like, dude, what the fuck? How dare you? Let's say Saddam Hussein then. Is that better? He was not allowed to serve in the military. He now has his own Praetorian Guard, but he was not allowed to serve in the IDF because he was too racist for the IDF. Understand what I'm saying here. In order to be designated by designated as a terrorist by Israel, you have to be seriously bad or a Palestinian child. Yeah, no, I'm saying like as an Israeli to be designated as an Israeli terrorist by the Israeli government, you literally have to be completely unhinged. I'm at the protest. Ben-Gvir is insane. He literally just formed the Israeli version of the SS. It's beyond insane that he has so much support, like a sixth of the population is supporting him. Yeah, the other part of Ben-Gvir's insanity is not just that like he wants to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. That much is clear. He wants to kill Jews too. Like he wants to literally fuck over like liberal Jews too. That's part of the reason why a lot of people are fucking protesting it. That's why he's considered a fucking terrorist. And by the way, for those of you who are, new to this kind of thing, it literally is expected. This is how fascist movements end up creating such exclusionary projects that you have to make the in-group, smaller and smaller and smaller. This is why we always say fascism is a suicidal ideology. The in-group is going to ultimately move away from Palestinians when they are completely fucking ethnically cleansed, right? When they are ultimately powerless, as they are now, they are going to move in to liberal Jews, liberal Israelis, gay Israelis, Israelis that want to get an abortion, Israelis that want to marry someone who's not Israeli. And then they're going to go back once again, like they did or in the original formation, to Israelis that are Ashkenazi Jews. You know what I mean? Because that's the other part of this equation, that like Judaism is an international an ethno-religious identity, which means that there are Jews from all different kinds of backgrounds. And originally, in its formation, there were certain Jews from specific backgrounds that were not considered to be as good as the other Jews. That's where you're going to get to. You're going to get Sephardic Jews that are going to be targeted. You're going to have the Mizrahis. You're going to have the fucking... Ultimately, you're going to get to... it's already happening with Ethiopian Jews anyway. And it's going to become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The in-group always becomes smaller and smaller. That's how it fucking works. We will end the fascist coup if you give us a fascist secret police force. Far-right Otzma Yehudit Party to support freezing coup legislation in exchange for establishing a national guard under Ben-Gvir. Fascist terror militia signed and sealed. There you go. All I'm going to say is this. For liberal Israelis that are tuning in, that are watching, this is a byproduct of not having, for lack of a better term, CRT in Israel. That's it. If your national project revolves on doing basically the same shit that's currently happening and ongoing, and you turn a blind eye to that, then there are always going to be people that say, it's not enough. We need to do more of it. This is a big problem in America as well. It's a major problem in the United States of America as well, with respect to the same attitudes that people have here. Fascists. That's how they do it. They take advantage of blindness that people have to the actual ongoing oppression, ongoing forms of oppression that is normalized in society, and just demand more of the very same. When you hear, for example, Steven Crowder or Ben Shapiro talk about police brutality in black communities and say, we need more of this. They're looking at the existing forms of oppression, police being an occupying force in black neighborhoods, and saying that everyone chirping about this is lying, feeding into the blind spot that people have, and then demanding more of it. In some respects, that's precisely what Ben-Gvir is doing in Israel, and other far-right ethno-statists are doing in Israel. And they will take away your civil liberties that you have you take for granted.
The same year as Tiananmen Square, a prominent Israeli politician, Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu, who had just served as Israel's representative to the United Nations, was speaking to students at Bar Ilan University, where he was quoted as saying, "Israel should have exploited the repression of the demonstrations in China. when world attention focused on that country to carry out mass expulsions among the Arabs of the territories. Regrettably, there was no support for this policy. But that's not entirely correct. Perhaps it was not popular mainstream sentiment at the time, but there were some Israelis who sided with Netanyahu on this issue.
Before we get to this, look no further than Netanyahu's own attitude towards settler terrorism over his rise to power and continued reinforcement in power. I am old enough to remember that Israel went from, oh no, we shouldn't be bulldozing these fucking houses, to we turned Jerusalem and every other place where Palestinians live into a fucking parking lot, deliberately dissecting their communities and building roads from within their communities with the express purpose of making sure that they are completely decentralized and cannot live their everyday existence while simultaneously engaging in acts of expulsion and also displacement, mass displacement. They did that. There was a time and place when the Israeli government's official attitude towards settler terrorism was, oh, we're just turning a blind eye to it, but like we don't really like it. It wasn't that the idea would come in with fucking guns drawn and forcibly expel Palestinians from their fucking homes so they can bulldoze it and then build an apartment complex on top of it. Yes, Israeli settlers can carry AR-15s around those neighborhoods, whereas it is illegal to own a firearm as a Palestinian. Yes.
In 1981, a Dr. Baruch Goldstein penned a letter to the editors of the New York Times. Israel must act decisively to remove the Arab minority from within its borders. Years after writing this letter, Goldstein would don his Israeli military uniform and arm himself with his army-issued Galil automatic rifle. He'd then walk into the Ibrahimi Mosque in the old city of Hebron, located in the occupied West Bank. When worshippers bowed their heads to the floor during Islamic prayer, Goldstein unloaded magazine after magazine into the crowd, firing at anything that moved. Hundreds of people would be hit, and in the end, at least 29 were killed in the mosque that day. In Israel, as well as the Palestinian territories, the outrage over this atrocity was immense. It stalled peace talks and created civil unrest among Palestinians. Dozens more would be killed by Israeli forces in the ensuing protests. Many familiar with this event know that the killings themselves aren't the end of the story. Following the massacre, Clyde Haberman of the New York Times would report on the ground from Hebron at Baruch Goldstein's gravesite. The title of the article, Hundreds of Jews Gather to Honor Hebron Killer.
1994, these kinds of atrocities were actually criticized. Didn't really mean much, but were criticized at least by the international community. Now it's a part of everyday existence. When the state does it, it's a little bit different, right? When the state is engaging in what they call mowing the lawn in Gaza, for example, that is seen as like an act of retaliation. How far we have come from 1994 is crazy. And even back then, it was insanely violent. Do not misunderstand me.
Indeed, the support appears to be beyond just nameless civilians. Dov Lior, the chief rabbi of the Kiryat Arba settlement of Hebron, where Baruch Goldstein lived, called him holier than all the martyrs of the Holocaust. The Jerusalem Post described Lior as one of the most high-profile national religious rabbis in the country. As a result of this mass shooting, the Israeli government outlawed the radical Kach party, of which Baruch Goldstein was a member. Another member was a young Itamar Ben.
There it is, Ben Gvir. This man just got his own Gestapo. This man just got his own secret police, literally like a couple hours ago. Part of Netanyahu's far-right coalition government. The reason why he spent 4 minutes describing this shit was because of this man right here, Ben motherfucking Gvir.
And is now famously the leader of the Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power Party.
The Jewish Power Party. Ben
Gvir has a colorful past filled with calls for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. In fact, he was so radical in his politics that he was barred from conscription into the Israeli military. To underscore his devotion to extremism, Ben Gvir hung a poster of Baruch Goldstein on the wall of his living room. Ben Gvir has called for harsher crackdowns on Palestinian militants and their supporters, as well as strict curfews in Palestinian villages. and mass deportations and targeted killings of terrorism suspects.
Yeah, terrorism suspect doing, that's a very liberal interpretation. Remember, if you live in occupied West Bank and you travel as a Palestinian, you travel out of it, you might not ever be able to go back to your home, see your children, see your family. They will literally expel you and say, you're gone. It's over. It's a wrap. GG's. How fucking nuts is that?
In these beliefs, he's also joined by the new finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. Smotrich, leader of the religious Zionist party, is no stranger to controversy himself. In 2021, he told Arab lawmakers in the Knesset that they are in Israel by mistake because founder of Israel David Ben-Gurion didn't, quote, finish the job when expelling the Arabs.
אני איתכם לא מדבר, אנטי-ציונים, תומכי טרור, אויבים. אתם פה בטעות, כי בן גוריון לא גמר את העבודה ולא זרק אתכם ב-48.
This is why I said it's like a little bit more aggressive than America. Like in America, we obviously systematically undermine the existence of black people, right? Or Native Americans all the time. But like, you don't have, I don't know, you have like, what's his fucking face? Stephen King, right? But even Stephen King cannot go out and literally say that to a black politician. Not Stephen King, Steve King, sorry. Not the author. I'm talking about, of course, the congressperson. So in some respects, Israel is like ahead of the game when it comes to like open racism. Like, could you imagine Steve King fucking like going up? I mean, he's a white nationalist. We know he is, right? Like, we know he's a fucking racist, right? Could you imagine him going up in Congress and like pointing to a fucking black politician and just straight up being like, it's an accident that you're here, like you're a slave. You know what I mean? Dude, they're racist fucking against other Jewish people who are darker skinned and not European. Yes, I know. That's what I'm saying. Because, and this is my message to liberal Israelis that are like, Hassan, you're so harsh about this shit. You're so harsh. You're so harsh. Brother, they're coming after you too, motherfucker, eventually. I mean, that's the fascist playbook. That's how this fucking works. They will always look for new enemies. They will always look for new methods of exclusion. They already do that to the Ethiopians. They already do that to the Arabs. They will eventually go through the different ethnic groups in Israel like they once did in the past. If I'm not mistaken, I thought Sephardic Jews were also considered like lesser than for the longest time, right? Yeah, Sephardic Jews were oppressed in Israel for a very long time. Ben-Gvir himself, by the way, is, again, if I'm not mistaken, a Sephardic Jew. So what happens to Sephardic Jews when they become a part of the in-group, white, if you will? If you want to use like American terminology, white. What happened? Became more fucking radicalized than anybody else. He's a Middle Eastern Jew. Sorry, yeah, Middle Eastern Jews like Mizrahi Jews. Not even Sephardic Jews. Mizrahi Jews are also oppressed similarly. The Black Panthers were an Israeli protest movement of second-generation Jewish immigrants from North Africa and Middle Eastern countries. It was one of the first organizations in Israel with the mission of working for social justice for Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. Literally. In its original formation, Israel was like, yeah, no Sephardis and no Mizrahi Jews. Like, they were oppressed differently. You can't judge from 1960 people, says King Israel 69. The reason why I'm bringing this shit up is because this happened once and it's gonna happen again. The entire point that I'm trying to make here is that like fascist movements always have to find a new enemy internally. For Hitler, for example, it was the Übermensch. Hitler did not consider the Slavs to be white, which Slavs are obviously considered white now, almost universally. But also on top of that, even internally within Germany, it wasn't just the Volk. It was always going to move on to the Übermensch, a specific type of Volkish people that were going to be the next group of individual Germans that were actually promoted and prospered. Down to the fucking height. You always have to fucking make your in-group smaller and smaller and smaller. That's it. Because it's built around the concept of exclusion. It's a never-ending battle. This is why I'm saying that, like, you justify it on the one end when it comes to the apartheid conditions for Palestinian people. It's going to come back and bite you in the fucking ass. It is literally doing it right now.
Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will enjoy free reign under Prime Minister Netanyahu, back as premier after a less than 2-year hiatus. As a result, we'll surely be seeing harsher treatment of Palestinians, and what's looking increasingly likely is the outright annexation of the occupied West Bank. Smotrich is insisting that the civil administration of the West Bank be transferred to his finance ministry, a move that is seen by many to be de facto annexation already. By taking the civil administration of the West Bank out of the hands of the military and into civilian control, it will be administered by the federal government of Israel. On top of that, the border police operations of the West Bank will be relinquished to the newly named National Security Ministry, which will in fact be headed by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Remember at the beginning of this video when I read you that Bibi quote saying that he wishes he'd used the Tiananmen Square massacre as an opportunity to expel Arabs from the occupied territories? Be wary of this pattern in the future. Like in 2014, when Bibi launched a ground invasion on the same exact day that Malaysia Flight 17 was shot out of the sky over Ukraine. The moments when news events spike media coverage and drown out other stories is precisely the time that we should be looking into Gaza and the West Bank.
Stop being so dramatic. This sort of thing has happened before without issue. German libs let spicy individuals have broad and exploitable powers in government to calm them down, and things turned out great. Yeah, famously. Things turned out really cool, like really chill right after that happened. You know, there was a little bit of an ideological diversity in the German government. I mean, come on now. This channel is one of my favorites, GDF Official. They make incredible videos. They are criminally underrated, and I'm very fond of them. Love them. Go support them.